Welcome to Super Great Kids Stories, fun tales to make you laugh and cry, with some of the best storytellers from around the world, recommended for ages 5 to 105. I'm Kim, and I love stories. Hello, story lovers everywhere. This week, we're very lucky to have a story from Nadine Wild-Palmer. She's a writer and a storyteller. Nadine likes stories from the Caribbean. She's going to tell us a Jamaican folk tale. Do you know that when I start a story, I sometimes say something from the Caribbean? What do I say? I say, mouth open, story, jump out. And I sometimes say crick, and you, the listener, have to say crack. And then I know you're ready for the story to begin. Crick, crack comes from the French-speaking Caribbean countries. Time to say thank you to some listeners who've been getting in touch and telling me all about their favourite stories. Livy says her son Manny and her daughter Ember love listening to our stories at bedtime. And Eluin, who is 3 and from Ireland, says she loves the frog story because it's got slime and a princess in it. I like that story too, Eluin. And Aria sent us a beautiful picture of her favourite story, which is Ngwenya and the Crocodile. It's a bright, happy picture, and both Ngwenya and the crocodile have big smiles on their faces. I think they might both have been eating birthday cake. Thank you, Aria, for that. It's on our Facebook page if any of you want to see it at facebook.com/supergreatkidsstories. If you want to support Super Great Kids Stories with a regular subscription, you'll be able to access all our stories without any adverts. Visit our Ko-fi page, that's Kofi, at kofi.com/supergreatkidsstories. Now, let's get on with the show. It's time to hear from Nadine Wild-Palmer. Mouth open, story jump out.
This story is about a race between a donkey and a toad. Picture this, a very ordinary day in a very ordinary savannah where Donkey was very bored.
I've been thinking about you, Toad. You've never beaten me at anything.
Well, you've never challenged me to anything, said Toad.
All right then, said Donkey. How about jumping?
And with that, Donkey sprung into the air. Toad jumped too, just not as high.
You see, Toad, I think you're just a bit too small, too weak, and too dumb to ever beat me at anything.
I bet I could beat you in a race, Toad blurted out, wishing almost as soon as she'd said it that she hadn't.
A race? Said Donkey.
All their arguing attracted the attention of the other animals in the savannah, and they gathered round in a small crowd to see what was happening. I'm not too small, said Toad.
Yes, you are,
said Donkey. I'm not too weak, said Toad.
Yes, you are,
said Donkey. And I'm definitely not too dumb.
Yes, you are, said Donkey.
The crowd of animals that had gathered began to discuss how they could settle the argument once and for all, and they all agreed that the best way was with a race, just as Toad had suggested.
All right then,
said Donkey.
That settles it. We're going to have a race. Where shall we race to?
Toad was terrified. She let out a small croak. I was thinking, she said, perhaps we should have the race in a few days. You know, give us both time to prepare.
No, said Donkey. I want to race now. On your marks, get set.
Just one moment, said a voice from above. It came from the wise old owl. She had been woken up by the terrible racket that they were making. Actually, Donkey, Toad is right. These things take planning. I suggest that you both run up the hill to the red hibiscus bush, round the brown shed, and then back down past the rusty car to the finish line, right back here, said Owl. Now what do you say? But how will anyone know when we've reached each point in the race? Said Toad. That is a very good question, said Owl. How about every time you reach a new point in the race and one of the marker flags, you call out so that we can see where you are?
That's quite a good idea,
said Donkey. And what will you call out then, Donkey?
Of course.
OK, and what about you, Toad? Said Toad. Well, we're all sorted then, aren't we? I'll see you back here tomorrow morning at sunrise. The crowd that had gathered got very noisy indeed as they began to talk excitedly about the race tomorrow. Chitter-chatter, 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 they went, and chitter-chatter, chitter-chatter, chitter-chatter some more, until to-wit-to-woo, Owl said. Right, you lot, clear off. I've got to get my beauty sleep, and I've got a lot of work to do if I'm to mark the race out for tomorrow. Toad made her way home, and on the way she picked up her 3 tiny toads from the local pond. But as she watched them hopping along the street home, trouble crept up on her. It followed her into the house, where Mr. Toad was already making dinner. Trouble hung around as they all ate dinner together, and trouble hung around as Toad had a shower and changed into her pyjamas, and it even hung around when they all had some hot cocoa before Toad put the 3 tiny toads to bed. Night, tiny toad number 1. Night, mum. Night, tiny toad number 2. Night, mum. Night, tiny toad number 3. Night, mum. Toad closed the door to her tiny toads and went out into the hallway, where she stood in a real trouble bubble. She stood there and she thought, and then she thought and she thought some more, until she had an idea, and her trouble bubble popped, pop. Her 3 tiny toads sounded just like her, and there were 3 red flags along the route of the race where each of them could hide. That way, whenever Donkey passed and said his "ee-aw," one of her tiny toads could croak, "Quack, quack," and everyone would think it was Toad. That would sure teach Donkey a lesson once and for all. In the morning, Toad woke up extra early, and she ran in to wake the 3 toads and tell them what the plan was. And they all sat down to a big hearty breakfast of slimy slugs and spindly spiders. When they were all full up, Toad took the 3 tiny toads and helped them into her basket on the front of her tricycle. Toad cycled the tiny toads up the hill to the first point in the race, the red hibiscus bush, where tiny toad number 1 hopped out. Tiny toad number 1, you know what to do, don't you? Yes, Mum. Quack, quack. See you later. Bye, said tiny toad number 1. Then Toad cycled up the hill to the second point in the race, which was the old brown shed. Tiny toad number 2 hopped out. Tiny toad number 2, you know what to do, don't you? Yes, Mum. Quack, quack, croaked tiny toad number 2. And Toad gave him a big smile before she cycled off to the third point in the race, which was the rusty car, where tiny toad number 3 hopped out and gave his mum a wink. Tiny toad number 3, you know what to do, don't you? Quack, quack. That's right, said Toad, and with that she hopped all the way to the start line. Donkey was already there waiting, kicking up dust and making a fuss. The last of the animals gathered round, and it was very noisy, so Owl let out a to-wit-to-woo to calm and quiet down the crowd. OK, we're ready to start. On your marks, get set, to-wit-to-woo! Donkey ran up that hill as fast as he could with all of his strength and all of his might and all of his power. And after a while, Donkey began to get a little bit tired and a little bit out of breath. So he looked behind him to see if he could see Toad, but Donkey couldn't see Toad anywhere. Ee-haw, ee-haw. Donkey slowed down and tried to catch his breath. Donkey said to himself,
I can't see that Toad anywhere. She must be so far behind. She's never going to catch me up.
So Donkey took a nibble on a nearby patch of grass. Then he sat himself down in the shade for a little rest. But Donkey fell asleep. When he woke up, he looked around him and there was still no sign of Toad.
Right then, better get on with this race.
And he began to run, slowly at first, until he reached the red hibiscus bush.
Ee-haw,
Donkey called out, and do you know what he heard? That's right.
Rock, rock.
Donkey could hardly believe his ears. He looked around him, but he couldn't see Toad anywhere. So Donkey ran and he ran with all his might, but Toad always seemed to be out of sight. He ran until he came up to the big old brown shed, where he let out a
Ee-haw.
And do you know what he heard?
Quack, quack.
Donkey was infuriated, so he ran and he ran with all his might, but Toad always seemed to be out of sight. He ran and ran until he came right up to the rusty car. And as Donkey approached the rusty car, do you know what he did? He let out a very loud, very big
Ee-haw.
And do you know what he heard?
Rock, rock.
Donkey was astounded.
I'm not going to let that little frog beat me in a race,
he thought to himself. So he ran and he ran with all his might, but Toad always seemed to be out of sight. He ran so hard and so fast with so much power that he kicked up a big cloud of dust. And just as he was approaching the finish line, Toad hopped out in front of him and went through the red ribbon. The crowd went wild. Confetti rained down. There was screaming and rounds of applause. Go Toad! Go Toad! Go Toad! Toad had won the race and she felt fantastic as Owl put a medal round her neck. The party to celebrate Toad's victory went on well into the afternoon, and all of the animals were there. Even Donkey turned up, although he sulked for a while by himself. He was very embarrassed. Donkey couldn't believe that he'd been beaten in a race by a toad. But do you know what Donkey never did again? He never showed off again. Definitely not about being bigger, or stronger, or cleverer than anybody else. And that suited Toad just fine.
Thanks for listening. I'd particularly like to thank all of our listeners in St. Louis in the US. If you'd like to support our podcast, then head over to ko-fi.com/supergreatkidsstories. And finally, if you want to tell us about your favourite story, go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/supergreatkidsstories or our website supergreatkidsstories.com. We'd love to hear from you. And remember to like, subscribe, follow and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.